I brought my stopwatch with me, so I'm pressing start. Good morning, everybody. Last week, the European Union withdrawal bill was tabled in the British Parliament. The fact that it's called the Great Repeal Bill tells you a lot about the mindset of those who are proposing it. Its passage through the House of Commons will be fraught, with many opposing it. The shadow Brexit Secretary, Keith Starmer, is already insisting on major changes, including guarantees on workers' rights and the retention of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. The Scottish and the Welsh First Minister have stated they will not support the bill in its present form. There are objections to the Henry VIII clause, which allows the government to simply nod through major changes to the bill. As one commentator said, that's like asking a genie for more wishes. The UK government has a slim majority, and it would only take a few Conservative backbenchers to overturn it and force a general election. The Great Repeal Bill has also to pass the House of Lords, and that will be a sterner test. And it's only one of 7 Brexit bills that must pass through the House of Commons. So we can see from that there is a most uncertain and potentially destabilising period ahead in UK politics. Concurrently, we have a leadership battle raging within the Conservatives, and Theresa May's authority is in free fall. From a media perspective, contradictory statements abound. Boris is whistling past the graveyard in regard to the exit bill, while his colleague Joyce Ansley has accepted that the UK has obligations to the EU that will survive its withdrawal. We also know Boris's policy on cake. He is pro-having it and pro-eating it. But at the same time, we have Mark Carney, who's the governor of the Bank of England, rapping him on the knuckles when he subsequently stated at a meeting to UK businessmen, before long, he said, we will all begin to find out the extent to which Brexit is a gentle stroll into the land of cake and consumption. We have a leading light from the Leave campaign, screaming on Twitter about the UK opting out of Euratom. In his Trump-like tweet, he bellowed, "Government morons say they are withdrawing from Euratom. Near retarded on every dimension." And as those of us who are Twitter users will know, the way you scream on Twitter is you use capitals. The word morons was in capitals. And 3 days ago, we have a government advisor saying that a hard Brexit could be as big a mistake as appeasing Hitler, while the Controller and Auditor General of the British National Audit Office is saying he was concerned about the risk that government departments were totally unprepared because of a lack of energy and leadership. That gives you some idea of what's happening in the UK, while David Davis is telling us that we may need a transition period because, wait for it, the French may not be ready. But the Frenchman leading the EU position stands waiting, and I hope he won't mind me paraphrasing his response to Boris and the UK in just 2 words: tick-tock. So there is a real fear that Brexit could spiral out of control. The immediate cause of the referendum, infighting in the Tory party, continues, and the vacuum created by Theresa May's inability to articulate and pursue a coherent and unified strategy is threatening to suck the entire political establishment into a Brexit black hole. That's my opinion on the level of uncertainty and instability in the UK, and that's the worst possible news for the UK, for Ireland, and for the EU. But not everybody is uncertain. Last Friday night, I was in Monaghan, where border communities against Brexit were awarded the European Citizens' Prize for 2017. They're a community group, and they know at first hand what a border means. And if they're certain about one thing, it's that they do not want to see that happen again. Equally, over the last 12 months, I've spoken to many groups. I won't list them, but they range from farmers to chambers of commerce. And all of them have one single message for me. Find a way, find a mechanism, find an alternative to a hard border. And I suppose it's here to some extent I disagree with Brendan Halligan. Not that it will be easy, but we have to find a way. And I have one or two possible suggestions. If we look at Europe at the moment, and we ask the question, how do we avoid a hard border? First of all, it's important to remember that the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, the UK government and the Irish government have all said that they want to protect the Good Friday Agreement. And indeed, the Parliament resolution made it very clear that it wants to protect the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts. So how can we achieve that? How can we, on this island, north and south, do that? I believe we need to come forward with imaginative and flexible and unique solutions to guarantee the Good Friday Agreement. The Centre for Cross-Border Studies have suggested two fairly similar models that might form the basis for negotiation, or at least begin a conversation. One model under the Good Friday framework maintains current flows of goods and services between the UK and the Republic, but no goods or services from the UK would enter into the EU. This would place constraints on the UK in regard to free trade agreements, in that it would have to largely mirror EU tariffs with third countries in order to avoid dumping on the Irish market. The second model maintains current flows of goods and services between Ireland and the UK, and also allows for a flow of goods and services from Northern Ireland into the Republic and onto the EU. Again, for this, the UK would have to adhere to all relevant EU regulations and standards, which, as an aside, I believe it will anyway, and I'd be very interested to open a discussion on that. But it would also impose certain constraints on the UK. These two models would see the Good Friday Agreement not as an issue to be resolved during negotiations, but as a potential solution or framework to some of the problems raised by Brexit. Now, the cross-border studies is clear that their models do not deal with every possibility, and they don't detail the technical and legal arrangements necessary. But it's a start, and we are running out of time. But there are many other models that we can look at across the EU. We could perhaps look at creating some kind of transitional partial membership of the EU, or maybe EEA membership for Northern Ireland. This would require a lot more autonomy than it has at the moment, but perhaps we could craft something that would work for the circumstances on this island. We could look to a number of distinct regional models within the EU, and I'd like to mention a few examples. Look at Andorra and Vatican City. They're both outside the EU, but their relationship with the EU is under negotiation. We could also look at a place called the Åland Islands. They're an autonomous, Swedish-speaking Finnish region. They have some derogations from EU law. For example, they're outside the VAT area, and there are restrictions on the rights of establishment and holding of property, etc. There are other examples, like, for example, there are two Italian comuni, Campione d'Italia and Livigno, in the Lombardy region, that are excluded from the customs union and VAT area, with Livigno's tax status dating back to Napoleonic times. There are two Spanish cities on the North African coast. They're part of the EU, but excluded from the CAP and the Common Fisheries Policy. They're outside the customs union and VAT area, but no customs are levied on food exported into either city. Look to the Channel Islands, Guernsey and Jersey. They're Crown dependencies, but they take part in EU freedom of movement of goods, but not labour, services or capital. They're outside the VAT area, but inside the customs union. The Channel Islanders are British citizens. If we look to the Isle of Man, another Crown dependency, again, inside the VAT area and the customs union. Now, I know I've ran through those, and most people won't remember what I've said, but I've simply outlined them to show that special status, unique solutions, whatever you like to call them, exist throughout the EU, and we need to start crafting ours to suit our particular system. Yes, there will be red lines, but now is the time to get beyond them. And finally, let me say, when I speak to the likes of Guy Verhofstadt, who happens to be the leader of the group that I sit with in the Parliament, and he is also the chief negotiator for the Parliament, he is in full agreement about no hard border, about protecting the Good Friday Agreement. But the question always is, how do you do it? So I believe we cannot wait for the EU to come forward with proposals. We on this island need to work together, and we need to propose solutions. I believe if we do, the EU and hopefully the UK will be prepared to respond in a positive way. But if we don't do it ourselves, I believe there is a real danger that it will not happen. Yes, Barnier is our chief negotiator. I'm not suggesting we change that. But if we put the proposals under his nose, I believe he will work to find a solution that will satisfy the particular circumstances on that island. I might finish off, I have a few more bits, but I know my time is up, by the quote, the famous quote from Roy Keane. And I think it applies to Brexit as much as anything else. Can somebody remind me what it is? If we fail to prepare to fail. And that, I think, is exactly what we need to keep in mind when we look at an all-island solution to Brexit. Thank you.